This version of the introduction is for those of you who can't make the Zoom session. And we're thinking about the Holy Spirit as a ticket. And the idea comes from the book The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. For all Aunt Jan's talk about it, death had only been a word. Now I knew that it could really happen, if to a baby, then to Mama, to Father and to Betsy. Still shivering with that cold, I followed Nolly up to our room and crept into bed beside her. At last we heard Father's footsteps winding up the stairs. It was the best moment in every day when he came up to tuck us in. We never fell asleep until he had arranged the blankets in his special way and laid his hand for a moment on each head. Then we tried not to move even a toe. But that night, as he stepped through the door, I burst into tears. "I need you," I sobbed. "You can't die, you can't." Beside me on the bed, Nolly sat up. "We went to see Mrs. Hoog," she explained. "Corrie didn't eat her supper or anything." Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. "Corrie," he began gently, "when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket?" I sniffed a few times, considering this. "Why, just before we get on the train?" "Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things too." So that's where the idea of being given the ticket by God just before we need it, in this case thinking of the Holy Spirit as ticket. And here's a mosaic showing the Holy Spirit coming down on the disciples at Pentecost, and you'll see that Mary is also there with them. And this is a reading done in a different way. From the fields it came, the first sheaf of barley cut for that year's harvest. It was carried high through the streets, crammed with visitors, and on to the temple. And then the priest offered it to God, giving thanks for the good land and for the gift of harvest. For that day was a celebration of the first fruits. It was Pentecost. Meanwhile, the disciples were all together waiting. Then suddenly it began. It started with a sound like the wind. But this was no gentle harvest breeze. This was a shaking and a roaring, a sound of power, whooshing and howling about the house, rattling every door and shutter. The sound seemed to come down from heaven itself, and it filled the house as the wind fills sails. Then the disciples watched wide-eyed as something that looked like fire came down, and tongues of flame peeled off it and rested on each of them without burning them. All of them were filled, for the Holy Spirit had come. And as it happened, their tongues were loosened, and they began to speak as the Spirit gave them words. These words were not Aramaic, their own language, but in languages that were unknown to them. A crowd had gathered by the house because of the extraordinary sound, but then they heard voices. There were pilgrims in Jerusalem from all over the known world, and they recognized the words the disciples were speaking. "He's talking Egyptian," said one. "That one's talking my language," said a visitor from Crete. And the same was true for all. Each person heard God's praises in their own tongue. "What can it mean?" they asked each other. But others among the crowd joked that the disciples had been drinking. The 12 heard what they were saying, and Simon Peter stood up to speak to the crowds. "Listen, I'll tell you what's happening. We're not drunk." It's too early in the day for that. This is God's promise come true. Do you remember what one of the prophets wrote long ago? "I will pour out my Spirit on everyone, young and old. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Young men will have visions, and old men dream dreams. And all who follow me, men and women, will be given my Spirit, and there'll be wonders." And this is from the Bible Retold by Andreas Kevington. And here's one of the paintings I found on the internet, which shows that some of the strong reactions of the disciples while it's all happening. Interestingly, Mary and other women are also present in the room at the time this happens, and they show the Holy Spirit coming down on them as well. but it's definitely a very dramatic kind of painting. And here's another poem talking about it. Spirit, how would it feel then to live in that God-shaken house? To feel the wind like the very breath of life, like the stirring of the deep before time, gusting through these small daily rooms, clattering and pressing against doors and shutters, not to be contained. How would it feel to look up, eyes dried by wind force, and see fire falling, flames bright and crackling and resting with heat that does not burn on each wondrous head? To be blown open, lock-sprung, lifted with wild, reckless joy, as words tumble out into the clear singing light. It would feel like this. It feels like this. And it is still only morning. And that's a poem by the same person, Andreas Kevington. And here are some images that I found on the internet. This one showing the fire coming down almost like pipes, piping it to the heads of the disciples from the dove, I think it is, in the middle of the picture at the top. There's different ways of people painting it. And this one, it almost seems as though the Holy Spirit is coming out of God's ears. I've cut the image in half so you can see it more closely, and then onto the heads of the disciples. It must be very difficult to think how to portray what was going on that momentous day. And this one shows the disciples after they'd received the ticket of the Holy Spirit and were given the power to speak out the good news in languages not their own. And the men in the foreground are listening in astonishment. And another poem. Love flows from God into man like a bird who rivers the air without moving her wings. Thus we move in his world, one in body and soul, though outwardly separate in form. As the source strikes the note, humanity sings. The Holy Spirit is our harpist, and all strings which are touched in love must sound. And that's Mechtilde of Magdeburg. And here's a more abstract painting with somebody's feeling of what it must have been like on that day. Jesus said, "So I say to you, which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?" So today we're thinking about asking for the Holy Spirit to come upon us, because God promises us he will give us the Holy Spirit ticket that we need when we need it if we ask. Is there something which you are thinking you are meant to do, for which you might be needing a Holy Spirit ticket? Something that you are thinking that you're meant to do, for which you might be needing a Holy Spirit ticket. May the Lord bless you in your creative meditation and reveal new things to you.